Well, look, let's talk about, we'll talk about this as well as just the economy generally with Mark Littlewood. He's Director General of the Institute of Economic Affairs, although not for long, soon to be Lord Littlewood. Good morning to you.
Morning, Julia. Good to be with you.
Congratulations. I don't approve of peerages, but I'll make an exception for you. I'm still holding out for Empress. Just saying, if anyone's listening, Empress is the minimum I will accept. Just on the issue of this, this criticism from the National Audit Office saying, the government operates a sticking plaster approach and has ended up wasting money on emergency repairs for schools because it's neglected the unflashy job of keeping buildings in usable condition. You can say this about schools, hospitals, all public buildings. This is, and again, we have this, don't we, with potholes in the street when it comes to local councils. This is how we run the country now, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to echo a little bit, Julia, of what Benedict said. I've got some sympathy with Gillian Keegan because I'm not sure that this should really be the job of a Whitehall department. I think it should be the job of a local education authority. I don't really want Gillian Keegan or the Department for Education in Westminster to be checking the concrete and the windows and the asbestos in every single public building.
And I'm certainly not sure that the Education Secretary should have this as a top priority when you've got, 150,000 kids who are permanently training, 1 in 5 who aren't in, and an abject lack of maths and science teachers in the 21st century. There are loads of other things. But this is it. This is where you've got the problem where the local authorities are saying, well, actually, we get the money from you for the schools' budgets to do this. We don't have the money. We know that local councils have had their budgets shrunk massively. Yes, they shouldn't still be spending money on stupid arts projects and yet another, street narrowing project which makes everyone's lives more difficult and doesn't actually solve anything. They should be spending money on the stuff that matters. But they say, we ain't got the money.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's yet another example of how Britain is over-centralised. We're about the most centralised democracy. I think we are the most centralised democracy in the Western world. More than 90% of tax and spend decisions are made at a Whitehall level. It's absolutely absurd. Local councils should have much more freedom to raise the money if they want to improve the local schools, whether that's changing the concrete mix or some other means of changing it. But unfortunately, we live in a country where virtually every important economic and political decision is taken in a 1 square mile radius in the heart of Westminster.
And wait a minute, the trouble is, when we have local decision making, I've watched this throughout my time as a political journalist, you have this point where people go, we need to have local decision making. So you devolve, you get local decision making, and then people say, oh, there's a postcode lottery across the country. So then the government takes back national control. People say, oh, we want local control. And you just got this pendulum that swings back and forward. At the end of the day, you can't have, the poorest boroughs in, say, Liverpool or the East End of London having to deal with everything themselves without having, centralised government money, because they're not going to be having the same sort of tax take as, say, Kensington or Oxford.
Every other Western democracy seems to have cracked this problem, Julia. Look at the United States of America.
No, I'm sorry. United States of America is not a good example. Their infrastructure is crumbling.
Look at Germany. Look at Germany. About half of tax and spending decisions are made at federal level and about half at local level. I don't understand why the United Kingdom is unique. Not being able to solve this problem.
No, that's a very interesting point. Again, I do think that Germany, again, they don't have like one massive big city like London, which is sort of the economic driving force of the country, and therefore they have some of the wealth spread out. And of course, it is a federal system, wasn't even a nation state until rather late in the day compared to us. But let's talk also about where we are with the economy right now. A couple of interesting stories. A new survey by the charity Christians Against Poverty. I thought we were all against poverty, but there we are. Nearly one in...
Christians in favour of poverty.
Yes. That's in it. Their meetings are good fun. Nearly 1 in 4 adults say they could not afford an unexpected £200 bill. If that came in, their finances will be completely scuppered. What do you make of that?
It's yet another example of the cost of living crisis that we're going through. We've had basically zero growth in the economy, there or thereabouts, since the global financial crash 15 years ago. We've got inflation, still pretty determined levels of inflation, meaning that the same amount of money doesn't stretch as far. We've had pathetic wage growth. I'm afraid this is, a decade, 2 decades, really, since the millennium. The UK's economic performance has been patchy at best and crushingly disappointing, I think would be a better way of describing it. And therefore, these are, if you like, the micro consequences that people are struggling to find 200 quid because We haven't really focused on growing the economy, improving productivity, and boosting our GDP. We've focused on pretty much everything but those things over the past few years, and this is the consequence, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I mean, that is certainly one of the issues, isn't it? I mean, I just remember though writing these sort of stories for years that actually the vast majority of people in this country do not have any savings. They're living, not just, month to month, but week to week. And in this crisis, if a big bill does come in, something breaks, washing machine breaks, worst case scenario, I remember certainly my family and loads of my friends, the idea that, you would lose an item of school uniform. I mean, that would be a crisis. People couldn't afford to replace it. That was before you got, the £2 trousers in Tesco and the like. Let's also talk about, the quality of some supermarket products. But 52% of Britons have reported noticing skimpflation among their favourite products, according to a monthly survey for Barclays. That is basically the quality of some supermarket products has fallen. We've already noticed the shrinkflation with these smaller size products. I've been a big fan of that, actually, in some of the, especially chocolate bars and like, getting back to a sensible size when they just got absolutely huge and we're all pretending we're buying it for two and we're not, we're all getting fat. But this is about actually decreasing quality, cheaper ingredients being put into products. Is that actually what's happening? And is that understandable given the pressure manufacturers are under from the costs of living as well?
I can't speak to how widely it's happening. I mean, I'm happy to believe people if that's what they assert in an opinion poll. But again, Julia, this is basically what inflation is. Yeah. I mean, if £10 doesn't stretch as far as it did a year ago, if you've got inflation of 10%, it stretches 10% less far than it did a year ago, then either the things you buy fall in quantity, or they fall in quality, or the price goes up, or some mixture of the three. That is what inflation is. And obviously, sometimes manufacturers, producers, supermarkets and the like won't immediately follow inflation. They won't just say, well, inflation's 10%, so all the prices are going up 10%. They face much more complicated supply chains. But one way of keeping prices lower is to reduce the quality of the product or the size of the product. If you don't do that, then the price of the product will go up, if you like, and you can pick a mixture of those three lanes if you wish. So unsurprising.
This is what's going to happen.
I think, again, a problem, inflation should have been spotted coming 2 or 3 years ago. This is what happens if the central bank prints money endlessly. You were predicting all of this. Just finally, briefly, if you would, the Financial Conduct Authority Executive Director, Sarah Pritchard, she said today that banks that wrongly deny accounts to politicians and their families face the prospect of being fined. This is particularly obviously after the case of Nigel Farage, who brought it to light when Coutts debanked him. We've actually seen, the boss of NatWest having to resign as a result of what happened on there, Dame Alison Rose. We're seeing a huge number of other politicians, someone would regard them as well, the more mainstream politicians and their children, grandchildren, even wives and husbands being debanked as a result. Is a fine good enough? I think they probably need to go further and actually look at what point would a bank be stripped of its licence to operate.
Exactly.
They've massively, I think, gold-plated this politically exposed person rule. But where I have a modicum of sympathy with the banks, not so much how NatWest and Coutts treated Nigel Farage, is the regulations are wrong. We brought in politically exposed persons regulations and money laundering regulations to try and deal with the kind of Don Corleone characters, not to try and deal with Nigel Farage and Jeremy Hunt and Richard Tice. So the regulations are way, way OTT. But then, as so often happens in Britain, when you have some heavy-handed regulations and they're implemented in an even more heavy-handed way by the banks themselves. So I think we've got to look at what banks need to do in order to retain their licences to operate.
Absolutely. There needs to be that ultimate punishment, doesn't it? Mark Littlewood, Director General of the Institute of Economic Affairs.